Donc, lui, nous allons s'écouter pendant 45 minutes à peu près. Et puis, il y aura une séance de questions-réponses. Et la parole est à vous.
Merci. Eh bien, merci beaucoup. Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier tous les membres du jury ainsi que toutes les personnes qui sont venues ici pour assister à la soutenance, que ce soit physiquement ou à distance. So, I will now switch to English for the presentation. The title I've given to my thesis is Phase Transition in Light Matter Systems for Quantum Sensing. So this title does not cover everything I made during my thesis, because I worked on very different topics. In particular, I worked on the interaction between light and matter, on quantum metrology and resource theories, and about the link between these topics. So similarly, because of time limitation, I won't be able to cover everything during this talk. Therefore, I decided to focus mostly on the topic of light-matter interaction, and I will also discuss a bit the subject of quantum metrology. My presentation will be divided into 3 parts. In the first one, I will give you some words of introduction and some context. In particular, I will introduce the notion of ultra-strong coupling regime and super-radiant transition. And then I will move on to present my own research work. So, if I had to summarize the topic of this talk in one sentence, it will be light-matter interaction at the quantum level. Interaction between light and matter is a very common phenomenon in physics, which we can observe in our everyday life. And it usually takes place by 2 basic processes, absorption and emission. So absorption is when matter absorbs light, for instance, when leaves absorb sunbeam for photosynthesis. And emission is when light is emitted by matter. For instance, when you scratch a match, you will see the air around the match will start to glow as you create a flame. Now, as a quantum physicist, the way I looked at light is a bit like this mosaic in Ravenna. If you take a look at it from afar, it looks like the wall is imbued by a continuous glow. But if you take a closer look, you see that the wall is actually covered by gold-covered stones that are patched together to compose a mosaic. And similarly, one of the most important discoveries of 20th century physics was the fact that light was composed of elementary particles called photons. So the general topic of this talk will be the study of light-matter interaction at the quantum level when light needs to be described by photons. So understanding of light on a more technical side, the understanding of light-matter interaction has gone through several important stages, which can be roughly organized on a timeline like this. In atomic physics in the 60s and 70s, it was already known that light was composed of photons, but this quantum behavior was difficult to observe and most importantly to manipulate in experiments. Therefore, in atomic physics experiments of the time, the atom parts, so the matter could be described by a quantum system with quantized level, but the light could be efficiently modeled by a classical wave, which was used as a tool to manipulate the atoms. So it's from this time that we got techniques such as atomic traps or optical tweezers. Then, in the 90s, with the advent of cavity QED, it became possible to use cavities made of 2 mirrors to trap a few photons or even single photons. At this stage, it became possible to observe and manipulate light at the single photon level. So at this point, our picture of light-matter interaction needed to be changed. So the matter can still be modeled by a few-level system or by a qubit, but the light now is described by a quantized excitation of a bosonic field. The first experiments in on this regime were conducted in the weak or strong coupling regime, in which the coupling constant is very small with respect to the bare frequencies of the qubits and the field. In this regime, the interaction can be efficiently modeled by the James-Cumming model. So its Hamiltonian contains terms which describe just the bare energy of the field and the qubits, and an interaction which describes emission and absorption process. So here you have the qubit being de-excited while a photon is created, so this is emission, and you have also absorption. In this regime, you have a very simple picture in which you have well-defined qubit excitation, well-defined field excitation, and you just have excitation bouncing back and forth between the two subsystems. And so in particular, the total number of excitation is a conserved quantity, and the ground state of the system is just a state without excitation, in particular it's a vacuum of photon. Now, as time goes on, our experimental capacity improved, and eventually, in the late 2000s, it became possible to enter the so-called ultra-strong coupling regime, or USC for short, in which the coupling constant becomes comparable with the bare frequencies of the system. When this occurs, the James-Cumming model is no longer valid, and we had to look at the Rabi model. So the Hamiltonian of the Rabi model is just the James-Cumming Hamiltonian, plus this so-called counter-rotating term here. As you can see, these terms describe a process by which the qubit is excited while a photon is emitted, so when two excitations are created at once, or when two excitations are destroyed. As a consequence, the number of photons, the number of excitation is no longer a conserved quantity, and so this simple picture of excitation being exchanged between the two systems is lost. Actually, what's going on is that the two systems are so strongly coupled that the frontier between the two becomes too blurred. It's no longer relevant to talk about light or matter. You need to think in terms of hybrid excitations, quasi-particles called polarions. And in this regime, the ground state is no longer a vacuum. It's a highly entangled state of light and matter, and in particular, the number of photons in the ground state is no longer zero. So this regime has now been achieved in several experimental platforms, and there are some more proposals to do it with other setups. So it's quite an active field of research from an experimental point of view. And from a theoretical perspective, there is also a lot of efforts to better understand and characterize the counterintuitive property which arises in this regime. One of such property, on which I worked a lot during my thesis, is the so-called superradiant phase transition. So far I told you, okay, if you have, in the regime where the coupling is small, you have the ground state is a vacuum of photon. When the coupling is big, you have a non-zero number of photons. Now a question we can ask is, what does the crossover between these two regions looks like? It turns out that if you have a single qubit and when the frequency of the spin and field are equal, you just have a smooth crossover and a continuous increase. But now if instead you look at many qubits interacting with a single bosonic field according to this model, which is called the decay model, and if you look at it in the limit where the number of qubits becomes very large, then you observe the following. So if you have for small coupling constants, you are in the so-called normal phase, in which the ground state is just a state with no excitation. So the two level systems, which can also be modeled by spin 1/2, are all pointing down, and the field is in a vacuum state, so its Wigner phase, its Wigner distribution is a Gaussian centered on zero. Then if you increase the coupling constant, at first nothing changes, but when you go across this threshold here, you enter a new phase called the superradiant phase, in which the spin experiences collective rotation, while the field enters a coherent display state. So its Wigner distribution is a Gaussian, which is no longer centered on zero. And you have two possible phases with a correlation between the direction of the spin and the direction of the displacement for the field. Now if you look at the number of photons in the ground state versus the coupling, so if you have a finite number of qubits, for n finite, you have these red curves here, where you just have a smooth continuous increase. But as n becomes bigger and bigger, you have sharper and sharper feature. And in the limit where n goes to infinity, you have this black line here where you are 0, 0, 0, 0, and then you start to increase. So at this point here, the number of photons is continuous, but its first order derivative is discontinuous, which is the mark of a second order phase transition called the superradiant phase transition. Now, this transition has been studied quite a lot, and there is and it's sometimes stated in the literature that this transition is a many-body effect because you have many qubits. I will refrain from using this term for two following reasons. The first one is because, well, you can already see on the previous slide that the qubits here only interact with this collective term, the sum of all sigma z and the sum of all sigma x. As a consequence, the qubits behave effectively as a collective system, so a single ladder with n levels. And in particular, it means that the Hilbert space size grows only linearly with the number of qubits. This is very important because when you're looking at a true many-body system, for instance, a spin lattice with next number interaction, in general, you have qubits which can point all in independent direction. And to describe this system, you need to look at a Hilbert space which scales exponentially with the number of qubits. So the decay model is much simpler to describe from a theoretical point of view. And the second reason why I won't call it a many-body effect is the fact that, it was shown recently that you can obtain this transition when you have many qubits, but you can also do it with a single qubit. If you just look at the Rabi model in the limits where the frequency of the spin becomes very large with respect to the frequency of the field, then in the limit where this frequency ratio goes to infinity, you can observe the exact same phase transition, which occur for the same value for a critical, the same critical value for a coupling constant. So this frequency ratio here can play the role of a large number of qubits. And finally, in a paper published this year, it was also shown that you can also see the same effect with two bosonic fields, provided you just add a small Kerr-like nonlinearity. So to summarize, stacking together many qubits is one way of achieving this transition, but it's not the only one. Rather, the general ingredients would rather be to have a bosonic field, a nonlinearity, which can be provided by the qubits or by this Kerr-like nonlinearity, and you need to be in the USC. You can already see this here. The phase transition takes place when G has this value, so when the coupling constant is comparable with the Baire frequencies. And from a physical perspective, this is because the Baire frequencies of the system tend to keep the spin down and the field in a vacuum state. So they tend to keep the system in its normal phase. And so for the transition to be activated, the interaction needs to be strong enough to compete with the Baire energy terms, which is exactly, by definition, the ultra-strong coupling regime. All right, so this is, now I've set the stage. I will now move towards my own research work. So I will present two projects which I've conducted during my PhD. And the first one concerns the study of generalization of the decay model called the two-photon decay model. So first, let me give you some words of context. So far, I discussed only the Rabi and decay model, which have the same general form. And I just say, okay, what happens if I increase the number of qubits, if I change the coupling or the frequency and so on. But now there is a lot of experimental and theoretical efforts to implement more complex model. So when the coupling takes a more exotic form. For instance, we can look at asymmetric coupling, where the rotating and counter-rotating terms have different coupling strength. We can look at Rabi-Stark model when we have this additional nonlinear term. And we can also look at this two-photon model, where each flip of a qubit is associated with the emission or absorption of two photons. So the photons are emitted or absorbed in pairs instead of one by one. The motivation, so these models are interesting for several reasons. First, as we will see shortly, they have non-trivial spatial properties which are of interest from a mathematical physics point of view. And second, they can be used to engineer exotic states of light or matter, which could be useful, for instance, for quantum technologies application. So during my PhD, I've worked mostly on this two-photon coupling interaction, and in particular on this model here, the two-photon decay model, which is just the decay model with this two-photon interaction. Now, one of the most salient feature of this model is the so-called spectral collapse. So if you look at the energy levels of the system versus the coupling, for small coupling, you have your usual system with discrete energy levels. But as G increases, at some point the energy starts to coalesce with each other, so to get closer to each other, and when G is equal to small omega over 2, the energy levels coalesce into a continuous band. And if you try to go even beyond that, the Hamiltonian is no longer bounded from below, so the system becomes unstable and the model breaks down. So far, this system was studied with one or few qubits, and it was found that the spectral collapse occurred for the same value of the coupling. But there was no result known for the limit where the number of qubits became very large. And in particular, we asked ourselves the following question. Well, we know that in the one photon decay model, when we have many qubits, we have this phase transition that takes place. And we know that in the two photon model, we have this spectral collapse. So the question we asked was, okay, if we take this two photon decay model with many qubits, in the region of validity of the model, before the collapse, can we have a phase transition as well? So this was our main question. We'll spare you the suspense and give you the answer right away. We found that indeed there can be a phase transition under certain conditions. The first one, as already anticipated, is the fact that the number of qubits must be very large. The second one is the fact that the frequency of the spin must be smaller than the frequency of the field divided by n. And since n is very large, it means that we must have a very small spin frequency. When these two conditions are met, we obtain the following phase diagram. So if we have here the spin frequency and here the coupling, when we increase the coupling, we can go from a normal to a super-Hadrian-like phase, and then we enter the unbounded region. So this is our main results, let's say. Now in the following, I will discuss how we obtain these results, what is the meaning of this frequency condition, and also discuss a bit the phenomenology of the transition. So the main tool we used to study this model was a mapping between the two photon and the one photon decay model. So this relies on the rationale goes as follows. As I've already mentioned, when we have the qubits behave collectively as a single ladder of system with n level. So when n becomes very large, we obtain effectively an infinite ladder of evenly spaced energy levels. This is exactly what we have with the bosonic field. So it means that when we have many qubits, their non-harmonicity disappears and they behave collectively as a bosonic field. Formally, this is expressed by this transformation called the Hochstein-Kolmogorov transformation, for which the spin, the spin raising and lowering operators can be expressed as photon creation and annihilation operators. So like this, we are able to map the spin on a bosonic field. And actually, we can also do the opposite, because if we look at the two-photon decay, the decay model, the bosonic operators A and A dagger only take place through quadratic combination. So we have A dagger A square, and A dagger square, so quadratic operators. And it turns out that these operators obey spin-like commutation relation. I have to say immediately it's not spin, exactly spin, because it's not SU2, it's SU11, which is an important difference. But still there is a formal similarity with the behavior of the spin, which we're able to exploit. So when we do these two operations, the coupling, the two-photon coupling term sigma x A square plus A dagger square assumes this form. So you can see here that we still have a coupling between a bosonic field and a, let's say, spin-like system, but now the coupling is only linear in the field instead of quadratic. So like this, we are able to map the two-photon decay on the usual one-photon decay, and then we are able to exploit all the theoretical arsenal that was developed to study this model. So we did this, so we performed this mapping, and then the first thing we made after that was to perform a semi-classical approximation in which we replace the B field by its average mean field value. So let me remind you that the B field here represents the collective excitation of the spin. And so this semi-classical approximation means that we're looking at the average direction in which the spin points, but we neglect the quantum fluctuations around this. When we do this, we found the following behavior. For small coupling, the system is again in a normal phase where all the spin are de-excited and the field is in a vacuum state. But now, when you go across a certain threshold, you enter a phase in which the spin are collectively rotated, and the field, instead of being displaced, is being squeezed. So its fluctuations are reduced in one quadrature and amplified in the other. This is not unexpected, let's say, since usually in quantum optics, linear field terms are associated with displacement and quadratic terms with squeezing. So I call in the manuscript, I call this phase super-idiotic or squeezed phase. And now, if you take a look at the value for which the transition takes place, so it takes place for this critical value, and as we said, the transition, of course, needs to occur before the collapse take place, so in the region of validity of the model, meaning that this coupling value here must be smaller than the collapse value, small omega over 2. And so this is where this frequency condition, big omega smaller than small omega over n, comes from. You need to be in this regime of frequency if you want to observe the transition before the collapse. So we obtain this result as in this semi-classical regime. Now and this is how we obtain the phase diagram I showed you earlier. Now we decided to dig a little bit deeper and to study the fluctuations of the spin as well. So for this, we use the following idea. As we have now established, the interesting regime, is when the frequency of the spin is very small with respect to the frequency of the field. This means that even if the spin gets widely excited, it will only have a small probability of exciting the field, because the energy scales are so vastly different. As a consequence, we can adiabatically decouple the spin and the field. So this was done with the technique of Schiffer-Boltz transformation, which is a transformation which allows us to decouple the spin and the field. Then we can project the field in its low energy subspace, and we obtain an effective dynamic which describes only the behavior of the spin near the transition. So like this, we're able to study the quantum fluctuations of the spin in the vicinity of a critical point, and we found that the spin should experience squeezing. So if I put together everything I said about the behavior of the spin, if I'm in the normal phase and I look at the spin in the generalized Bloch sphere, the spin are all pointing on average in the z direction. And if we are far away from the critical point, the fluctuation in the x and y direction are about the same. Then, as we go closer and closer to a critical point, the average direction remains the same, but now the fluctuations are reduced in the y direction and amplified in the x direction. And when we go across the transition, the spin are collectively rotated, and so the average position moves across the Bloch sphere. As I discussed at the very beginning of my presentation, so this model can exhibit some non-trivial quantum properties, and in particular, spin squeezing can be a resource, for instance, for quantum metrology or other quantum technology protocol. So this is one of the interests of this exotic light matter interaction model. Finally, we're also, thanks to this treatment, we're also able to study the critical exponents of the system. And we found that the model is in the same universality class as the decay model, which is just a mean field Ising class. So this project was the first I was involved in during my PhD. We published these findings in PRA in 2017. And all of what I discussed was done at the Hamiltonian level. We focus only at the Hamiltonian, meaning that we are looking at an isolated system which does not exchange interaction with the environment. Now, sometime later, we decided to study what would happen if the interaction with the environment is taken into account. So, in this case, instead of the eigenspace of Hamiltonian, we need to look at the Lindblad master equation, which contains the Hamiltonian term plus dissipation. So here we consider photon loss and spin dissipation, and we studied the steady state of this dynamical equation. Now it turned out that this problem was much more challenging than the previous one, and this is mostly because of this spin term here. Why? Because these terms are local terms. So each spin, the spins are interacting independently with their environment. And as a consequence, it's no longer possible to model the spin by a collective excitation. Therefore, if we want to describe the quantum fluctuations of a system, we need to take into account the full exponential Hilbert space, which is a very difficult problem to do, even numerically. So to go around this difficulty, we decided to do two things. First, we decided to forget for now about quantum fluctuations and to focus on average quantities. And second, we performed a cumulative expansion where basically we neglected some correlation between light and matter. So with this mean field approximation, we are able to considerably simplify the problem and but still to observe some interesting effects. So the first one the first thing we found was the following. We found the existence of two phases which look a lot like the normal and squeeze phase that we had in the Hamiltonian case. But in the Hamiltonian, we had a second order transition when we went first from the normal phase to the squeeze phase. Here, by contrast, we found some evidence of B-stability. So if you plot the number of photons versus the coupling, so here in black you have the normal phase where you have 0 photon in the steady state, and here the colored curve is the second phase where you have a non-zero number of photons. And so in this regime so for very small coupling, only the normal phase is stable. For high coupling, only the second phase is stable. But here in this intermediate region, both phases can be stable at the same time. So the fact that we have base stability at the mean field level indicates that our system will experience a first order phase transition. So we go, by adding dissipation, we go from second order to a first order transition. And then the second study we performed was to examine the effect of dissipation. So we plotted so basically we looked at the phase diagram, sorry. We looked at the phase diagram of the system, so the coupling versus the spin frequency, and we found the following. When the dissipation rate is relatively low, we have a phase diagram which is marked by two free regions. So a region in which the normal phase is stable, a region in which the squeeze phase is stable, and a region in the middle in which the system is unstable and it does not reach a steady state. And we found that when the number of qubits increases, the region of stability of the squeeze state shrinks. And so we expect that in the limit when n goes to infinity, we won't see the phase transition anymore, and we will only have a normal phase and an instability. So, however, we found that when we increase the dissipation rate, the squeeze phase is not stabilized, and we can have a phase diagram in which we have a normal phase, a squeeze phase, and a region in the middle where both phases are stable at the same time and we have B-stability. And even when n becomes very large, we will retain this phase, and so we can have a phase transition. So this shows that in this dissipative case, and somewhat counterintuitively, controlling the dissipation rate is key to ensuring that we will be able to see the phase transition. Finally, note also that this is a bit different from the spectral collapse, because the spectral collapse was an instability controlled by the coupling, so when we increase the coupling at some point we become unstable. Here, by contrast, in this region here, we found that we could increase the coupling as much as we want, the system was still stable. So to summarize, when we go from the isolated to the dissipative two-photon decay model, we go from a second order to a first order transition. We go from a spectral collapse, which is controlled by the coupling, to an instability, which is controlled by the dissipation rate. Oh, sorry. And very importantly, in the isolated case, as we discussed, we can only have a transition in this large detuning regime where the frequency of the spin is very small. By contrast, in the dissipative case, we found that we could observe transition even when the frequencies are equal. This is important because experimentally it's difficult to couple systems with very different frequency, especially if you want to reach the ultra strong coupling regime. So this shows that the transition could be easier to observe than we first thought. In this case, we were able to study the quantum fluctuations in the system. In the dissipative case, we were limited to average mean field value. So, as a next step, we would like to study also to look for the quantum fluctuation in the system, but this will probably require some more advanced numerical techniques. So this concludes the second part of my talk. Now I'm going to move to the last the last project on which I'm going to present. So I'm now going to take, so this will still be about this superradiant transition, but now I'm going to take a step back and look at it from a different angle. So if we take some distance, if we think about what is a phase transition, by definition it's a situation in which the behavior of a system changes very abruptly when some parameter is modified a little bit. So near a critical point, a system is very sensitive to external perturbation. One idea we could have is that maybe this sensitivity could be exploited to develop sensors. And this was done in many different systems. So for instance, if you take electrical circuit near the superconducting to metal transition, a small change in temperature will lead to a huge difference in resistance, which can then be easily measured. So like this, you can do a thermometer. But since the extra temperature can also be caused by an incoming photon being absorbed by the system, this is also these circuits are also used to make very accurate photodetectors. Another example I've given in my manuscript would be bubble chambers. So all of this, of course, is decade-old physics. But now, in the last few years, let's say 15 years or so, there's been quite a bit of work that has studied the quantum phase transition, in particular superradiant transition, in the context of metrology, of sensing. One motivation for this is the following. We know that quantum mechanics limits our ability to measure the world. We know that if we take measurement apparatus, whatever it is, there will be noise of technical origin, experimental imperfection, but there will also noise of quantum origin, which is due to the fact that at the end of the day, your measurement apparatus is in a quantum state. So even if you can remove all the technical imperfection, you will still be limited by this fundamental noise. So the field of quantum metrology tries to understand and mitigate these fundamental limitations. And so all of these works try to bring together ideas coming from the field of quantum phase transitions and quantum metrology. And one conclusion that many of these works have reached is the fact that, in principle, if you operate a device near a critical point, you could, in principle, bring the quantum noise to an arbitrarily low level. So you could still be limited by technical imperfection, but the fundamental noise could, in principle, be reduced arbitrarily. Now, of course, this sounds very nice. This sounds very promising to improve the performances of sensors, but as we all know, there's no free lunch. So this claim comes with quite a lot of subtlety. And one of such, which has not been discussed too much to this point, is the duration of a protocol. So near a critical protocol, because the gap of the system closes, the system experience was known as critical slowing down, in which the dynamics of the system is slowed down dramatically. And so it was argued that because of this, if we operate a system close to a critical point, we could expect to have better sensitivity, but we could also fear that it would take longer to operate the system. And it was actually claimed recently that because of this, the increase in protocol duration would always offset the improvement in precision, and that quantum critical protocol would never be able to outperform standard methods because of this. So I have to say that this claim is still rather recent, and it's not very clear whether it's true or not. Therefore, we decided to study a quantum phase transition in the context of sensing and look in detail at the trade-off we can achieve between precision and time. So the setup we consider is the following. We have a qubit whose frequency is unknown, and we want to measure big omega. For this, we make it interact with the bosonic field according to the Rabi model in the regime of parameter where this frequency ratio is very large. So if you recall my first part, this is in this regime the Rabi model can experiment a phase transition. And so we want to see if by bringing the system close to its critical points, we can measure omega with enhanced sensitivity. So one from practical motivation, if for instance this qubit, the qubit is made by the two hyperfine levels of an atom, then this energy difference, this qubit frequency, is sensitive to an external magnetic field. So measuring this frequency can be useful, for instance, for magnetometry. And very importantly, our system is finite size in the sense that it involves only a single qubit interacting with a bosonic field. So these kind of ideas might be useful, for instance, for space-resolved magnetometry. So an analogy for this protocol, which I borrowed from Dr. Felicetti, is can we improve the performances of a compass by putting it into a cavity? Now, if we look at the specific protocol, it takes the following shape. We start from the system, from the zero coupling constant, where the matter and light are decoupled. Then we slowly adiabatically increase the coupling in order to bring the system closer to its critical points while keeping it in its ground state. And then so in the ground state, the ground state of the system can be found again by the same techniques as the one introduced earlier. And it reads like this. So near the critical point, the spin will be stuck, will be frozen in its ground state, while the field will be squeezed. And very importantly, the amount of squeezing, so the system, the state of the field, depends on this unknown parameter omega. So the idea is, okay, we want to prepare the system, then we're going to measure the bosonic field, and then use the measurement results to infer the value of big omega. Now, there is one thing I need to emphasize about about how we can extract omega. So it's the fact that the information is contained in the fluctuation of the field. So if, for instance, we look at homodyne detection, if we perform homodyne detection, what we expect to see would be a signal fluctuating around 0. And depending on the value of omega, what will change will be the variance of the signal. So I insist on this because, in general, oftentimes in quantum mechanics, quantum metrology, you have a signal centered around a non-zero value with some random noise around, and you want to average out the noise to extract the signal. Here, you don't want to do this. You don't want to average out the noise, but to reconstruct its statistics, because it is in these statistics, that in this variance, that the information is encoded. So this is why I put here this quote from Büttiker, so it's from the electronic community. The noise is the signal. And so we study that if we perform this protocol and we're able to reconstruct the fluctuation of the signal, we can in principle achieve a precision that scales at 1 over g squared minus gb squared. So this means that if we operate at a value g which goes closer and closer to the critical point, to the critical value gp, we can have in principle arbitrarily large precision. Again, let me emphasize that this is studying only the noise of quantum origin. So we are saying that if we can remove the technical imperfection, we can also suppress the quantum noise. But of course, in a practical experiment, we have to take into account both quantum and technical noise. Now, here I explained to you how we could measure the frequency by performing an homodyne detection. Now, we could imagine to look at other protocols. For instance, we could also look at the photon number, or things such as photon spin correlation and so on. So it turns out that one of the central results of quantum metrology allows us to compute the optimal precision that can be achieved when we use the best possible strategy. So this is quantified by this quantity called the quantum Fisher information. In a nutshell, it quantifies how sensitive the ground state of the system is to a small change in the unknown parameter omega. So we are able to compute the optimal precision, and we found that the optimal precision also diverges near the critical points, and we find that our protocol our homodyne detection is indeed optimal in the sense that it allows to saturate this band. And we found that other strategies can also be optimal, such as photon number detection. So far, okay. So far we're very happy. We have found a protocol. We characterized how we could use it to measure the spin frequency. We found that in principle we could have arbitrarily low quantum noise. So this is compatible with previously known results. But now, as I mentioned, what we are interested in is the trade-off between precision and time. So now we need to look at the duration of the protocol. The idea is the following. As I said, we prepare the system adiabatically, so we slowly increase the coupling. Now, to make sure that the system remains in the ground state and does not jump to the excited state, we need to do this very slowly, and the speed is set by the gap of the system. The smaller the gap, the slower we need to go. So we came up with this optimized time-dependent ramp. Basically, the idea is simply that at first we're still away from the critical points, so the gap is still pretty large and we can allow to go a bit faster. And then as we go closer and closer to the transition, the gap becomes smaller and smaller, and so we have to go more and more slowly. So we came up with this preparation ramp, which allows us to minimize the preparation time while ensuring that we remain in the ground state. Now if I take this curve and I just invert it, it also gives me the time needed to reach the system, to prepare the system at a given distance from the critical points. And so here in particular, I find that the preparation time also diverges near the critical points. So now comes after the critical point, now comes the critical moment. Putting together the results for the time and the precision, we find the following relationship. So again, operating closer and closer to the critical point means longer time, so longer tau, and higher precision. And we found that the two are linked by this quartic scaling law. Now, this scaling law is interesting because if we compare this with more traditional methods to estimate spin frequency, for instance, a Ramsey protocol in which we directly address the qubit with the electromagnetic field. In this standard protocol, the precision scale like the time square. And as I discussed in the manuscript, this is actually a very generic property of time-independent protocol. So it looks like, at a first glance, that our protocol, we can gain precision faster as time goes on. But there's a catch, which you may have already seen. If you look at this prefactor here, it involves this frequency ratio, which needs to go to 0, which needs to be very small in order for a transition to take place. So we have a good scaling, but a bad prefactor. This suggests that our critical protocol will perform poorly for small time, and then as we operate for longer and longer tau, so as we go closer and closer to a critical point, we will have a precision that will increase faster. So we can hope that at some point we'll be able to catch up and to what performs standard methods. But then we came across the second important let's say feature, which is the fact that if we go for a very long time, it means going very close to critical points, and at some points, some of the approximation we made to derive this limit here break down. So it's not extremely clear what precision we can achieve when we go very, very close to the transition. However, this result shows that it is indeed important to look that time is an important factor, and if we want to use quantum transition to improve sensing protocols, this needs to be taken into account. Finally, so I'll skip very quickly, we also looked at the dissipative case, and basically we reached similar conclusions, so good scaling but a bad factor. So if I summarize everything, we study of the super-radiant transition of the DP model could be used for critical sensing. So this, we studied this system by putting together tools from the quantum physics, from the quantum phase transition community, and from the quantum metrology community. And we studied in particular in detail the trade-off that arises between the improved precision and the increased time. We found that there is a non-trivial interplay between the scaling and the prefactor. So from a purely, let's say, practical perspective, our results are a bit inconclusive in the sense that it's not very clear which precision we can reach in the end when we go very, very close to phase transition. From a fundamental perspective, however, it shows that this trade-off between time and precision is something non-trivial that needs to be that can be studied a bit more. So as a future research direction, we'd like to investigate further this link, in particular to see if we can find a connection between precision, the time, and the critical exponent of the model to study this trade-off in a more general setting. And we also want to improve our protocol. So for instance, one way to do this will be to get rid of this adiabatic procedure and to look at dynamical protocol or optimal or quantum control procedure, for instance. And finally, we are also discussing with a group in Berlin. They have a setup with cold atoms in which they can implement the Rabi model. So we are thinking whether this experiment could be used to test some of our predictions. Yeah, so as a general summary, after some introduction, I presented you the critical effects that arise in the two-photon coupling model. So I showed you that at the Hamiltonian level, we have this complex interplay between the phase transition and the spectral collapse. And when dissipation is taken into account, we can have bistability or instability controlled by the dissipation. So these systems have both very non-trivial spectral properties, and they can be used also to prepare, to engineer some exotic state for light or speed. Then I change the perspective and I show all the finite size transition of the Rabi model could be exploited for a sensing purpose. So we studied this model with tools from quantum phase transition and quantum metrology, and we found that there is a complex interplay between the precision and the time. And finally, I've also worked on other topics during my presentation, namely the application of resource theory for metrology, which unfortunately I did not have time to present here. So it's about time I stop talking. Before I finish, let me just share with you some insights I developed during the course of my PhD. Historically, quantum mechanics has been developed along two different lines. The first one is the limit of quantum optics and atomic physics, when we have few body or dilute systems. So these systems are interesting because of their conceptual simplicity and our ability to control them. So there are tools of choice to access fundamental properties, such as superposition, entanglement, spectral inequalities, and so on. The other limit is the limit of many bodies strongly interacting systems, typically what you have in condensed matter. So these systems are marked by a very rich phenomenology. Particularly, you can very easily observe critical effects. But, at least for a long time, they are much more difficult to control. And so now there is some efforts to bring together ideas from these two viewpoints, for instance, by putting bigger and bigger systems in the superposition, or by looking at many-body entanglements. And I think that USC could be provide an interesting connection, in the sense that as I showed you, in USC you can have this phase transition, so you can recover some, not all, but some of this complexity traditionally associated with condensed matter. But you can do so in systems that are very simple, or indeed with a single qubit coupled with a bosonic field. So you keep this simplicity and their controllability. So from this perspective, I think the transition coupling could be an interesting bridgeway between these two worlds. And with that being said, I have to thank all of you for listening to me. So I have to thank all the people from the PQ, especially, so first of all, the administrative staff, Jocelyne, Sandrine, Nathalie, Anne, and Aisato from RIKEN. Then I have to thank all the people from the CAI team, all the collaborators with which I had the pleasure to work during my PhD, and finally, all of my families and friends. Thanks again.
Okay, so thank you very much, Louis, for this excellent presentation. So I don't know if people want to leave the room. it's time now for the question and answer session.
Yes.
So usually we start from the referees of your work. So maybe we can start with Peter.
So yes, switch off.
Okay, so maybe we can start by Peter, rather. Peter, is that okay with you?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah. Yes. 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 Well, the assumptions are, let's say, the standard assumption of quantum metrology, which is to say you prepare your system, you let it interact with the parameter you want to estimate, and at the so this is the derivative preparation and so on, and then at the very end you make a measurement. So here in your case it will be your modeling measurement, and you assume that it is perfect in the sense that if you assume that you can make there is no technical imperfection in the last measurement. So when we derive this bound here, the assumption we made is the fact that this homodynamic detection is not noisy in any way. We're able to make a perfect homodynamic detection. And I have to say, so this is of course not realistic from an experimental point of view, but this is the standard procedure you made in quantum metrology, because what you want to what we wanted to study, what we wanted to focus on, is the quantum noise of the measurement device, which is the cavity and the qubits. So we wanted to just look at the source of noise due to these elements, and so for this we assume that the noise of all the other steps was just zero, because of course, and similarly we assume that we are able to perform perfectly the derivative preparation. There could be, of course, additional noise because of this and so on. So it's to answer your question, the assumption we made here is a perfect homodyne of photocounter detection, because we decided to keep this source of noise out of the analysis. No, of course. Yeah. Okay. So for this answer, I will say okay. So this is a tricky. Yeah, this is a good question and a bit of a tricky one to answer. So this is the part, at least the way I understand it, because it's I think it's not such an easy procedure, and I couldn't find a very clear answer in the literature. The thing is, if you look at your homodynamic detection, it will be also with a physical system, and so therefore so you have to use bit splitter, laser, or whatnot, and so this system will itself have technical noise and quantum noise. So when you have to look, I guess, so here what you are assuming is that if you want both the technical and the quantum noise associated with the homodynamic detection are much smaller than the quantum noise associated with the critical procedure. And then of course when you want to look at the full system, what you need to look is all the sources of noise in your system, and look at what is the dominant one. So here we assume that whatever happens, the dominant source of noise will be the one associated with the quantum state of our bosonic field. I wanted to study how to reduce this quantum noise. But then, of course, I mean, if we improve this noise, precision, if we reduce this noise arbitrarily, at some point, at some stage, it will not be the dominant source of noise any longer. So yeah, this is indeed a tricky part, which is the fact that in quantum metrology, you always look at one source of noise, but of course, if you reduce it at some point, it's no longer relevant to look at it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, but I guess sorry, it's a little bit.
No,
It's not about it. It's not relevant for your protocol. In some stage it will be. But I mean, what is the type of measurement you do when you do homodynamic measurements? What is what quantity do you measure?
How do you implement homodynamic detection in practice? Okay. Then what you would have to do would be to look at the field. For instance, in this case, it would probably be the field escaping the cavity of the system. So okay, there are two things. If your system is actually made by an atom interacting with light in a cavity, for instance, you take the light coming out of the cavity, then you put it in a beam splitter with a coherent state in the other port, and then you look at the and then you look at I think it's the coincidence count on the other side. So the phase, the coherent state you input in the other beam splitter serves as a phase reference, and then if you change this coherent state, you can actually measure different quadrature. So this is how it will be a photocounter at the very end. So you make the signal escaping the cavity interact with this bosonic field, and then at the very end you make a photocounter, a photon number detection.
Yeah. Now, whenever you do a photon number detection, there is now fundamental noise.
There is. It's and as I discussed, the only question is, will this fundamental noise be more problematic than the one arising? Yeah, of course. As I discussed in the manuscript, the thing is, if you want to describe everything, you have to look at a chain of system that goes from your system to the brain, to the cells in your brain. So it's at some point you just have to assume that just to take some sources of noise out of the equation. Yes, of course, there will be photon shock noise in the... Yeah. Of course. Of course. Absolutely.
Okay, so maybe then a little bit on this photon phase transition.
Yeah.
I think so actually, about the symmetry, so maybe I don't remember exactly. I go back to the original model.
The one photon decay?
The photon.
Yes. Yeah, it is. Yeah. So you
consider which type of it's shown that this is already phase transition. So which type of symmetry is broken?
So the symmetry. So in the one photon decay model, the symmetry is the one by which you invert sigma x by minus sigma x and a by minus a, because this gives the one photon term invariant. So here in the two photon decay model, if you replace sigma x by minus sigma x, and if you replace a by ia or minus ia, so if you do a rotation of pi over 4, a quarter term rotation in the phase space, you will leave this term here invariant. So this is a 4-fold symmetry because you can apply it 4 times, and so after so this is the symmetry that is broken. No, yeah.
This will so won't this actually then change also the a and a term?
No, because a is replaced by plus a exponential of I pi over 2a, and a dagger by exponential minus pi over 2, so the a dagger a is invariant. So you have degenerate, yeah. So the actual state, you have, so your Hamiltonian becomes degenerate. You have two possible configurations. Yeah.
And this linear displacement is speed beta is now in this new
Yeah, exactly. This beta here. Yeah, this beta is the displacement. This beta is the displacement of the field. So this beta here is the rotation of the spin. And yeah, yellow shell come back off.
Can you comment once more about this SU11?
Yes, of course. Here it is. So this is, oh, maybe it's a bit small. I can make it bigger. Just give me a sec. Yeah. So if you look at these operators here, so if it was the usual SU2, so the difference mostly, well, you can see it in physical term or mathematical term. In physical term, the difference is that when you look at SU2 as a spin, you have a bounded system. You have a finite number of cable, even if it's very big. Here, by contrast, you have a bosonic field which is unbounded. So on a more on a more mathematical term, SU2 is a compact group, while SU11 is not. Oh, compact algebra, while SU11 is not. And then if you look at and if you want a more, let's say, hands-on difference between the two groups, if you have SU2 here, the commutator between K plus and K minus should be equal to plus K0 instead of minus K0. So the commutator here remains the same, but you have this difference between the two algebra, which is seemingly, and this difference actually is seemingly maybe harmless, but actually when you develop, when you actually do develop a term, you see that some terms that are stable with the SU2 algebra becomes unstable with this SU11. So this is the important difference. But still,
they get the same or should be a close approximation with these terms?
So could you reapply a Sheldrake-Markov on the K plus and K minus?